Assalamu alaikum. You're watching Views and News, and I'm Faisal Rehman live from our Islamabad studios. Today we'll be talking about a very important developing story, and that is about the Iran nuclear deal talks. These talks are being held in the capital of Austria in Vienna, and as we all know that JCPOA, that was known as a Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Now this deal seems to be closer than ever, and a lot of analysts, a lot of people who are a part of this particular meeting, they believe that days ahead would be very decisive. Well, let's hope so. And the Iranian chief nuclear negotiator also says that outcome of Vienna talks hinges on the Western decisions. Now, there is a lot of, I would say, difference as far as the approach is concerned in the ranks of the American senators also. They believe that this case should be brought in the Congress and then they should talk about it. But no decision should be taken on other lines and on other grounds. Second important factor is that if you remember, this deal was done in 2015, and we all really hailed and appreciated the efforts of the then foreign minister, Mr. Javad Zarif. They said that he is perhaps the best negotiator ever. And then in 2018, once President Donald Trump took charge, we all know what happened. They in fact backed out. Though I remember that this was not only regarding United States of America. America was one important country. 5 of the Security Council's permanent members, that included obviously Americans, the French, the British, Russians and the Chinese, plus 1. That was Germany, and obviously European Union played a very important role. Now there are a lot of sanctions on Iranians, and perhaps that is the reason that their economy is in dire straits at the moment. Look at the dollar, which is gaining strength in each passing day. And I would also mention that at that time the Prime Minister of Israel was Benjamin Netanyahu, who in fact traveled when Barack Obama was the president, and he spoke so much against him in the Congress, nobody uttered a word against him. An interesting part was that because he was somebody who was totally against this deal, but at the end of the day, yes, Benjamin Netanyahu's decision or the approach prevailed, and the Americans rolled back. Now, it seems that they are very close in fact cutting a deal. But what exactly would be the ingredients of this deal? What sort of a rollback are we expecting? What sort of pressures would be on the Iranians? Because it was more about the centrifuges, its enrichment, and the Iranian nuclear program. Now, one thing is very clear, that they don't want to manufacture an atomic bomb, but perhaps they want to use this technology for medical purposes, for agricultural purposes. This is something which is used in almost every field in nowadays. So we'll be talking about that in detail, and let me quickly introduce you to our panelists. We have with us in our studio on my right is Brigadier retired Tipu Sultan Sahab, who's a senior analyst. Thank you so much, Brigadier Sahab, for your time, sir. Pleasure to have you on the show. And we have with us from Iran, Mostafa Khoshcheshm. He is an expert on Iranian affairs and a senior analyst. Thank you so much for your time, sir. Pleasure to have you on the show. And we also have with us Syed Muhammad Ali. He's an expert on international relations, and he's joining us from United States of America. Thank you so much, Syed Muhammad Ali, for your time also. But let me start off from you, Brigadier Sahab, as you heard what I said in my introduction, that this deal is perhaps a very important deal, not only for the Iranians, but perhaps for the Western world also. A lot of sanctions on the Iranians. Generally, it was believed at that time that $200 billion of the Iranians that has been frozen. Perhaps that money could be released. At the same time, you talk about the trade of the Iranian energy resources, whether in the form of gas or oil, or perhaps the trade of precious metals. That is also very important. Sanctions could be lifted on those. And at the end of the day, the Iranian economy is going to survive, because these sanctions really need to be lifted. Now, sir, what we are hearing from Vienna, it seems that the negotiation is pretty close, and a final deal might be settled within the next week or perhaps the end of this week. How important this is, sir? And should the Iranians this time really believe in what the Americans say? Because earlier one president signed it, called it the deal of the century, if you remember, sir.
Yeah.
And that deal of the century wasn't there once Mr. Donald Trump took charge. So pressure on the American congressman, pressure from the Pentagon, and last but not the least, pressure from the Israelis.
Well, let me tell you, Faisal, let me first say hats off to the Iranian tenacity and diplomacy and their restraint in the face of what Israel has been saying. They supposed to have assassinated their top scientists also on 27 June 2020. Israel bombed Iraq's nuclear facility on 7 June 1981. Iran has been so great in its diplomacy and restraint in facing the threat not only from Israel, from America, economic threat, security threat, and all sorts of things that they faced. That they assassinated so many Iranians of repute and positions. That,
General Soleimani is one example.
Yeah, Qasem Soleimani is one example. So the nuclear non-proliferation, so to say, after the Americans bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is something very partisan. It is absolutely very obvious that the nuclear game, non-proliferation game, is only being played in the Middle East and South Asia. Nowhere else, and then at the dismemberment of the Soviet Union, it was played again. So I think this deal that we are talking, which is the negotiation which is going on in Vienna, it's very important. Even now there are the Jewish lobby is against it. Even now there are so many ifs and buts and polls and all that, and Biden is under trouble. When I saw the caption of your program over here, I was thinking that these major conflicts generated by the West against the very countries that are our neighbors should finish now. If these sanctions were not there, perhaps we would have had gas from Iran and other energy problems could have been solved. Iran is a great neighbor. It is a great geography, starting from the Hormuz, going right up to Turkey and all, and Black Sea and Caspian Sea and all. The reaches of Iran are tremendous, and the regional countries need to recognize that. Now, coming back to this nuclear deal, I think the Iranians are so good in carrying out their minute diplomacy that they have not only fought this international belligerence, nuclear belligerence.
Oh yes, indeed.
Should I say, and the policy and the partisan policy generated by Netanyahu, and he was speaking so belligerently in the UN General Assembly against Iran, and this deal should not be there. It must be. They are used to doing. They tried to bomb even Pakistan. It is only that our Air Force was strong enough to thwart them. Everybody knows that. Although Washington denies that, the Israelis deny, the fact is.
But we know the reality.
We know that they have been bombing Syria's small nuclear facility from 2018, 1920. They are busy even now. So their intention and the thrust of that country is very much in front of you. How do they think? What is their arrogance? And having failed to dislodge Iran from its aims and objectives of democracy and fair play, now they are negotiating with them again and again. I mean, it is something bizarre that you negotiate a deal between the European Union and the Americans, and Jawad Zarif that did so much of phenomenal diplomacy, and you close a deal, and then you say no, we are pulling out of it. There are sanctions again on. Americans have sanctioned so many countries in the world that you can't even count it. Look what Putin is saying in the Ukraine conflict. Now, I think if this deal comes up, the mere fact that they are negotiating in Vienna, which is the headquarter of international nuclear facility and proliferation and all that, the mere fact that they are negotiating with Iran is that the steam of the Americans against Iranian effort is over.
All right, sir.
Uh,
Now let me also bring in the gentleman from Iran, Mostafa Khoshcheshm Saab, senior analyst and Iran affairs expert. Now, Mostafa Saab, number one, how hopeful you as an analyst, as somebody who has been following, writing this story, who's been commenting about it, how, I mean, let me put it this way. How optimistic are you about the final deal, sir? And is it going to be a win-win situation, which we witnessed in 2015 when Mr. Jawad Zarif was, in fact, a part of this very important JCPOA? But whatever happened later, we'll also talk about that. But do you think, are they really that close in cutting a final deal, sir?
Hello, and thanks for having me. Well, I believe there's a 50-50 percent chance. We cannot be much optimistic about it. I'm just hearing my voice through the earphone. There's an echo. Thank you. It's now better. Um, Let me explain it this way. When Americans came up with this assessment back in 2006, that they may not overthrow the Islamic Republic, they went for calibrating the containment strategy against Iran in order to slow down the growth of Iran's power components in the nuclear industry and missile industry, regional power, and God knows how long they would go on and on and on in order to contain Iran's fast growing power. So JCPOA was the first part, and it's not the end of the road. That's why when Donald Trump exited the deal, John Kerry in 2017 said on the United States NPR national radio that we would have withdrawn from the JCPOA as well if Iran hadn't been joining the talks on its missile program and regional power. There have been six agreements between Iran and the United States or the US allies, the European allies, back, in the last 20 years. Um, Including the JCPOA, which was the last one. According to American European officials, Iranians have always been compliant with their undertakings under all these terms, under all these deals, because Iran has been looking for a conflict resolution. But Americans and Europeans have never been compliant with their undertakings under any of these six deals, with the JCPOA being the last one, because they've never been looking for a conflict resolution. They've been looking for containing Iran. And then on that road, their only undertaking, which has been removal of sanctions, has never happened because sanctions have been their weapon of choice. So that's why many Iranians were critical of President Hassan Rouhani's administration's, JCPOA strategy, and they were complaining that he should stop the haste that he had towards this deal, and he should have requested for a well and thorough mechanism for verifications, as well as a system of guarantees for the deal. And that's why, because there was no verification, there was no guarantee for the Iranians. The Americans left the deal very easily after Iran fully complied with its undertakings. So this time around, Iran knows that the government of President Raisi has come up to power through an election this year, this Iranian year actually, or last Christian year, by those who were critical of President Hassan Rouhani's foreign policy. Now, they insist very much that there needs to be guarantees and verifications. And they want a removal of sanctions that came under the JCPOA, as well as those that were imposed on Iran in violation of the JCPOA under the Donald Trump maximum pressure policy throughout the past several years. So what we see now on the table is that the Biden administration acknowledges that the maximum pressure policy of Donald Trump has failed, but he continues those sanctions and the same maximum pressure policy in practice. They say they would like to join the JCPOA and remove the sanctions and revive the deal, but in action, they are defying Iranians' justified calls for giving Iran assurances and for removing all the sanctions that came after the JCPOA in violation of paragraph 25 of the JCPOA. And they are not showing very much strong zeal to prove their allegation and claim that they want to deal with Iran. Now, in this framework, you may also remember that the U.S. is moving towards decline, and their shameful withdrawal from Afghanistan is one of the best examples to prove that. So they know that their top priority now should be China, and they need to shift to South China Sea in order to build up power in there, in order to slow down Chinese economic power and growth through increasing threats. So they want a deal, but they don't want to pay the cost. They don't
All right.
want to pay the price. They don't want to remove the sanctions that has been said in the JCPOA, and they don't want to provide Iran with assurances. So this was supposed to be the last round of the talks. There should have been a deal now declared. But as you can see, as we've come to the last days and final rounds, now Americans still insist on the same game that they've been playing in the past 2 months. They are not ready to give Iran assurances that they may not leave the JCPOA again. The last time they did it, they inflicted hundreds of billions of dollars of damage to Iran and Iranian economy, and Iran has been the only side that has kept the JCPOA alive by paying lots of costs in the past several years after the Americans withdrew from the deal.
All
So
right.
this is the last
Mr.
chance, I believe. The negotiators are said to be coming back home. That's outside the agenda. That was not on schedule. They have changed the schedule now. It shows that there is a tough bargaining happening in the negotiating room. As far as I know, Iranians are not going to withdraw from this deadline, and they would not cross this deadline. That they want the assurances that come in a variety. Maybe I'll touch on that later.
All right. Now, coming to you, Syed Muhammad Ali, first of all, sir, how the American media in particular, the American media is reacting to this story, number one. And second, also please inform us about this very important point, the trust deficit. The Iranians really look forward that a final commitment should be given and they should move forward. Do you think the deal would be done or would be settled on the previous details, or perhaps something new is going to be added? And if something new is going to be added, what that would be?
Well, there's mixed reaction depending on the media source, frankly, because there's so much polarization, within the media. But on Iran, the assessments are even with CNN, it has a very conservative assessment of foreign policy relations, American foreign policy relations with Iran. But the basically in terms of what the Iranians need is that they don't want another president coming in, possibly a Republican, to come in and do the same thing that happened to the deal the last time around when President Trump came in. So there is, that concern, but, behind that are the compulsions of American politics itself. So foreign policy is actually one of those areas where the American president has a lot of discretion, personal discretion, right? And over the past 30, 40 years, increasingly, he has the ability of determining various types of action, even preemptive action. And there is debate within the U.S. how the Congress should or could tame the powers of the American president to determine foreign policy, so that there isn't this kind of a U-turn. But you see, in the case of the Iran deal, what that would mean is trying to develop bipartisan consensus. And it seems that there's an ambiguity, I mean, even within the Democrats, because this is such a long-standing animosity, going all the way back to 1979 and then the hostage crisis, that on the one hand, the Democrats are also cautious, and they have viewed the JCPOA, as an attempt to slow down and contain Irani nuclear ambitions. And that's the point that President Trump had picked up on and said that I can get a much better deal. But now what the Republicans are saying and debating is that, hey, it's not only about, about the nuclear ambitions, it's also about other missiles that
Missile
Iran
programs,
keeps
yes.
developing. So let's bring that stuff onto the table. It's also about Iran's role in the region. And when it comes to Iran's role in the region, we have to remember that Israel is not the only one, that constantly brings up Iran as a problem. Within the Muslim world, we have Saudi and UAE, and given Iran's role in Yemen, although in the past year or so, there has been attempts by Saudi and the UAE to try and negotiate bilaterally with Iran, but that hasn't really delivered much. I mean, in terms of Iran's regional posturing. So, there are also, those concerns to be managed. And then within the US, it's this, how to develop bipartisan consensus to insulate any kind of an agreement with Iran. And
All right.
that is, of course, a
Saeed Mohammed
concern
Ali.
within Iran as well.
Saeed Mohammed Ali, one important factor, since we all know that there is a greater understanding among the Gulf countries and Israel now. Whether you talk about UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, and
Egypt.
Egypt for that matter, that is a very close ally of the Saudis as well. Now, sir, this understanding, do you think could be a major hindrance regarding this particular deal, sir?
Well, Iran then flexes its muscle where it can, right? So, in the Middle East, besides besides the Palestinian situation, two other, areas where it's been trying to create its influence and has done so successfully is in Iraq. Right? It's not entirely the sort of unfolding situation in Iraq is not entirely to the Iranian, liking, but it still has a lot of influence with Muqtada al-Sadr and others. But then also in Syria, and that has created a lot of devastation, right? And there are reasons for that, because of earlier overstretch, in Libya, in other places, there was a concern that any attempt to support Bashar al-Assad now is going to create more space for NATO, as it did France had led the campaigns against Gaddafi, but in the name of responsibility to protect, which is a UN protocol, they sort of went in and deposed him, which was not the original understanding. So Bashar al-Assad has gotten readily support from Russia and from Iran, who are trying to avert American and other Western influence in Syria, and they've managed to do so to an extent that now even Middle Eastern countries, despite Bashar al-Assad's tainted record, have been compelled to to recognize the reality that he's not going anywhere. So Iran does have its posturing in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria. And those are also issues of concern, because they those are issues that the US has to consider, and then it has to consider vis-a-vis its more traditional partners in the Middle East.
All right. Now, Brigadier Saab, one important factor. Now, there was a statement given by the French authorities, and they said that deal text agreed by negotiating parties except Iran. Now, that means that the P5+1, they have come to a final conclusion. And as just mentioned by our friend Ali, that initially it was more about the nuclear ambitions, about preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear state. They have also started talking about their missile program. That is important.
Yeah.
And secondly, they are, the Iranians I am talking about, they still believe, rather they suspect that US withdrawal from the deal again perhaps could be witnessed.
Yeah, I think Syed Muhammad Ali Sahab brought some very important points. That there is an indication, that there is an atmosphere and implication of what is the regional situation. The regional situation is politically and strategically imbalanced. On one hand, the Muslim countries are extending their hand of friendship with the Israelis. On the other hand, the Palestinians are suffering, the Iraqis are suffering, the Syrians are suffering, and there is a conflict in Yemen also.
Yeah.
So, the situation is such that Israel and America have always been talking of bombing Iran. They came very close to doing that, but then they retracted that, and Iran took their defenses and all that. The point is that unless the regional countries have a cooperative sort of an atmosphere and a coordination, the lasting peace will be a far cry. This is a situation where the Americans have always exploited the situation of Israel against the other countries. Israel is a nuclear power. They have a facility in Dimona supposed to have blasted, and the Americans noticed that and looked on the other way. Whereas Pakistan has been under stress, so has been Iran and other regional countries. So there is a political and strategic imbalance in the region, which sort of worries you that even if this deal is signed, whereas the other issues remain, like you said that they have brought down now the missile program, and although the original deal which was,
And Iran is never going to back out from that, sir.
that is its defense.
Yes.
That is what deterred them, in fact. That is what it did. And unless the situation stabilizes in Iraq, it stabilizes
If you
in
remember when General Soleimani was killed in that drone strike, you remember? Obviously, he was killed in Iraq, and the presence of the American soldiers in Iraq. I mean, those soldiers came under attack by the Iranians. Just imagine
Yeah.
a country like Iran,
And,
under sanctions, they
not
went
only-
after them.
Not only that, the Israelis had a bloody nose in Lebanon. We all know that. When Hassan Nasrullah's forces defeated their armor brigade and all that, and they bombed their buildings and destroyed their infrastructure, and now they have turned Lebanon into sort of a country with all sorts of chaos, a country which had a growth rate close to 6% and all that, and it was a country to be visited by so many travelers and all that, and tourism. The people are talking that it is a failed
Obviously,
state.
sir, let's blame the Gulf
It's in a-
countries
in
for
a-
that
in
also.
a very bad state.
I mean, Lebanon was the most, I would say, visited place at that time, sir. Beirut in particular. That was the center where the flights would land and then take off for Europe or United States.
Now, I will tell you another important thing. You see, you can never ignore what is happening in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, what happened is a lot of people from Herat, including their governor, taken refuge in Iran. The Kabul government is not in full control. The TTP is being beefed up by ISK, Khorasan and all that, and remnants of Al-Qaeda. The Kabul government does not seem to have control south of Nuristan up to Nimroz and Helmand and all those. And there have been attacks inside Pakistan in front of Nokundi, Iranian territory of Zaidan and Nimroz and Helmand. You remember a pro-Pakistani politician was killed in Mastung. In the same area, we had an attack in Panjgur, we had an attack in Noshki. So this entire situation, and who is fooling whom? We know for a fact that the foreign agencies are funding all these terrorists so that the region does not stabilize. So and then you freeze the Afghan money and decide to give half of it to 9/11 victims. What about those people, those hundreds and thousands of people that you have killed in Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, in
Afghanistan?
Afghanistan? No,
Well, they have the double standard. But sir, Brigadier sir, one important point, since we'll be running out of time. There was this telephonic call made, and the French president, Mr. Macron, spoke to his counterpart in China, Xi Jinping, and they said, and they rather agreed, let me put this, that Iran must fully comply with its nuclear responsibilities. Nuclear responsibilities. They did not talk about the missile program. Whereas the other story tells us that the P5+1, including the Germany, they have agreed on a certain format.
yeah,
And now
the
they
Baltic
believe
Sea
that the
line
ball is in the
yeah.
Iranian court. Is the ball in the Iranian court now, sir?
No. Their problem is that they cannot digest the Iranian and the Chinese relation, and the Chinese, have an agreement of billions of dollars with Iran.
400 billion.
$400
in the
billion
next
come to Chabar.
25 years.
It
yes.
is a very good thing to do. And let me tell you, for Gwadar, Chabar is not a problem. Chabar will facilitate us. In naval strategy, if the ports are less than 200 kilometers apart, they will be considered as one facility. If the BRI succeeds from the northern areas of Pakistan into Gwadar, and Chabar succeeds, a success story. So what Macron was talking to the Chinese was, he could not tell Chinese what he might be telling the countries in Africa. It is a very ambiguous statement. Iran is a responsible country. They had a deal with the European Union and America in 2015, which Donald Trump scrapped. And he is right. If Trump comes into power again, or Republicans come to power again and come to the Jewish lobby in the United States, then what?
Again,
So they want,
back to square one?
Back to square. They want guarantees. And these guarantees be given by the European Union, and they have to stand their bloody ground on that.
So, well, let's see. The coming days and the weeks would be very crucial, and we'll get to see what's going on. Now, sir, the Russian ambassador to the Vienna talks, Mr. Mikhail Olenov, simply said non-stop talks are going on. Now, Mr. Khoshcheshm, the point is that, again, there seems to be one major problem, and that is about the trust deficit, sir. Earlier, whatever we all witnessed, what happened in 2015 and then 18 onwards, we really want that Iran should flourish. Iran should get back to its own previous glory, sir. Iran is a great country. They have a very great history also. But what we would like to get to understand is that, sir, every country has its own ambitions and goals and objectives and targets. Do you think, sir, if this missile program becomes the bone of contention between the Iranians and the Western world, do you think this particular agreement could be derailed, or these talks could just, at the end of the day, could not be fruitful?
No. As a matter of fact, when President Rouhani was in office and his last final months, the Americans and Europeans were insisting very much to include a new paragraph in the JCPOA, and that was a bone of contention. But when the critics of President Rouhani voted for the revolutionary government of President Raisi, the Americans and Europeans realized that the policy in Tehran has changed. Since Raisi always stressed in his presidential campaign, as well as after winning power, that JCPOA would be kept, but would not be the center of his foreign policy, that he would try very hard to develop ties with the neighboring states. He would try very hard to reinvigorate the Iranian economy, which has very many intact potentials that were never activated or touched by President Rouhani. and that's why Raisi was elected to office. So he said it very honestly that JCPOA would not play a very pivotal role in his strategy when it comes to economy or foreign policy. And then the Americans first did some evaluations and assessments to, measure the veracity and honesty and truthfulness of these remarks, and they came up with the result that he says what it means really, that could not, expect this revolutionary government to talk about missile program or regional power. Iranians are very much, resolved to keep this missile program growing, because we do all remember when we were alone under the harshest ever sanctions imposed on any country during the Iraqi imposed war on Iran, when Saddam's missiles were landing on our heads, and we were under tough sanctions. Even truckloads of barbed wire were not allowed to come to Iran, seized the borders between Ukraine and Russia. And Saddam Hussein was supported by 37 nations directly and less than 100, nearly 100 countries directly and indirectly. So Iran has been very much resolved to keep its missile program. And the Americans realized that they could not expect anything more than a revival of the nuclear deal from this revolutionary government. So they have given up talks about missile program or JCPOA on Iran's regional power. In the last 2 months, that President Raisi administration resumed talks, the nuclear talks with the West. So because from day one, the new Iranian team has been stressing to the Americans that if these things happen, they would leave the Vienna talks. First, Iran just wants a revival of JCPOA 2015. It would not agree to change the tax because Iran has paid its dues upfront in cash, but it has never received the merits even under President Obama. And Iran believes that the West owes the merits to Iran. Second, if they speak Iran's missile program or regional power, they would leave the talks immediately. As far as I know, and I'm proud of the talks, the Americans and Europeans have never talked about Iran's missile program in the course of the talks. That's one of the achievements of this revolutionary government and this Indian genius team, who has proved to be cleverer than the former team of negotiators. And so uh, we have told them very directly and very clearly that there is not going to be any further JCPOAs on Iran's nuclear or missile or regional powers in future, even if this JCPOA is revived. The end game is this JCPOA, which will be complete 10 years from 2015 that it started. That would be 2025. That's it. Now, the problem is that Americans are not really willing to pay their dues. The problem is that they do not show regret in action. They do not want to build Iran's trust. Let's remember that Iran is under the JCPOA. It has modified its undertakings. 14 months after the US withdrew, Iran is still in full compliance, and only 14 months after the US withdrawal, Iran started modifying its undertakings, but it is still under JCPOA. The West, the Europeans, Chinese, Russians are still under the JCPOA, but the Americans are outside. So the party that should build the trust, the opposite side, is the Americans. So they need to provide it with the assurance in order to, move ahead. Otherwise, as I know, and I was telling you in the first question, responding to your first question, this was supposed to be the last round, but Americans are still playing games, and they, defy the call for providing Iran with assurances as well as removing sanctions that came after the JCPOA. That's why uh, the negotiators are coming back to their capitals. This is not a good sign. This is a bad omen.
All right, sir.
Still, there's a
Sir,
50% chance.
since I'm running
for
out of time, sir, let me put this last question to Syed Mohammad Ali. Sir, there is another very interesting story, and we read about it, said that the US Republicans and the hawkish Democrats, including some key lawmakers, they recently voiced the opposition of reviving the deal. Yes, good enough. Arguing that any agreement with Tehran should address Iran's ballistic missile program. Okay, that we have already talked about. And regional activities, obviously referring to what is happening in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, or maybe in Yemen. So let's talk about that, sir. Let's throw light on that.
So I think that's the problem. I mean, we get a good sense of what's happening sort of, internally in terms of the Irani mindset and some of the politics around that. I mean, we see, less willingness, because that trust has been shattered by the actions of the past American administration. But there's still a lot of resistance, and domestically right now, President Biden is in a kind of a tough spot because while his economic performance is good, inflation is high, the polarization in American society and in the American polity is still quite, the reconciliation tone is still not evident. It's quite a jarring polarization. The grip of President Trump over the Republican Party remains quite strong, and this is one of those things that he felt that he needed to do in conjunction with the Abraham Accords. So we've already seen, and this is unfortunately an issue where even amongst the Democrats, like you're saying, Faisal, that one could see attrition. Not all Democrats are on the same page that we need to resolve this lingering animosity with Iran, which has all these regional implications, the proxy warfare then that goes on within the Middle East, right? There is not that realization. And very recently, 165 Republican lawmakers have indicated that, they are going to oppose this deal tooth and nail, and lest it goes to Congress really, the longevity of this deal remains up in the air. So, one wonders, I mean, there is this positive signaling around the deal, and potentially it could have, stability benefits for the broader region, not only the Middle East, but also, places like Pakistan. It would help sort of, the connectivity goals, but there is a lot of politics, right? And not everyone is on the same page in terms of now managing even the outfall from Afghanistan, right? Where India and Iran are reweighing their options. There's and sanctions and this kind of animosity only exacerbates those strains. So we'll really have to wait and see what kind of a deal comes to the fore from America, and if there's a willingness on the Irani side to take this on. And the lowest common denominator on the deal might not mean much, in terms of, and will the Iranis actually want some respite, right, for the next couple of years, and give it another shot, or do they want to remain belligerent? This also remains to be seen.
All right, let's see, sir. I think the coming days are pretty interesting, pretty important, and we'll get to see what's going on. And we all hope and pray that there should be a final deal. It should be a win-win situation for all the concerned parties. And especially, why wouldn't we not like Iran to progress? We would love that Iran should get back on its own sanctions should be removed, and obviously, as they say, the regions grow, and we would like Iran to grow so that it can also benefit Pakistan and the entire region, I would say, and bring in peace here
we
as
all
well.
want that
Last
the
30
relation
seconds, sir, for
between
you.
the major countries of the region like Iran and Saudi Arabia and everybody should improve, so that we are not, fleeced and taken away by the strategic aims of the people who are living thousands upon thousands and oceans apart from that, and have their strategic interest, and then in the end harm the regional countries. So there should be a increased regional cooperation against the belligerents of the West and the Americans in the region. Only then, if we get together, I think the overall situation then is going to improve.
Definitely, sir. Brig, thank you very much, sir, for your presence in the program, sir. I would also like to thank Mostafa Khoshcheshm Saab and Syed Muhammad Ali as our analysts in the show, sir. And that's all we have for this hour. I'll see you inshallah on Monday next week. Till then, you have a great weekend. Khuda Hafiz.